Melissa had always been my world, ever since that fateful night when our parents died in a tragic car accident. I was 18, barely an adult, but I suddenly found myself thrust into the role of both big brother and guardian to my 12-year-old sister. Melissa had always been bright, full of life, and I promised myself that I would do whatever it took to make sure she had everything she needed, even if it meant sacrificing my own dreams. Little did I know how heavy the burden of that promise would become. For years, it was just the two of us. I worked 2 jobs to keep a roof over our heads, gave up on college to make sure she could stay in the private school our parents had chosen, and did my best to fill the void left by their absence. Melissa was my priority, my responsibility. I never complained. I was proud of the woman she grew into, a kind, intelligent, and fiercely independent young woman. But as she grew older, I began to notice a change in her. It started with small things: her demanding attitude toward the clothes she wore, the places she wanted to eat, and the vacations she expected us to take. I chalked it up to teenage whims and indulged her as best I could. But as time went on, her demands became more extravagant, more unreasonable. By the time she turned 25, Melissa had developed a taste for luxury that was far beyond anything I could afford, but I continued to spoil her, thinking I owed it to her after all she'd been through. Then came the day she announced she was engaged. The news should have filled me with joy, but instead, it filled me with dread. Melissa's fiancé, Tom, was a good man, successful and caring, but I knew what was coming: the wedding. Melissa's eyes sparkled as she showed me the engagement ring, a dazzling diamond that must have cost Tom a fortune. I forced a smile, congratulating her, but inside, I was bracing myself for what lay ahead. The planning began immediately. Melissa wanted the best of everything: a grand venue, designer dresses, gourmet catering, and a live band. She envisioned a wedding straight out of a fairy tale, with no expense spared. I should have known it was coming, but the first time she mentioned the cost, my heart nearly stopped. "David," she said one evening, casually sipping her wine as we sat in her elegantly furnished living room, "I've been going over the budget, and I think we're looking at about $100,000. I choked on my drink. $100,000? Melissa, that's insane! How are we supposed to afford that?" She waved her hand dismissively. "Don't be so dramatic. Tom and I have some money saved, and I'm sure you'll help out." "Help out?" I repeated, incredulous. "Melissa, I've already put off my own life to take care of you. I don't have that kind of money." Her eyes narrowed. "So you're saying you won't help?" "I'm saying I can't help to that extent," I replied, trying to keep my voice calm. "I'm happy to contribute what I can, but $100,000 is out of the question." Melissa's face darkened, and for the first time in my life, I saw a side of her that scared me. "You've always said you'd do anything for me, David. This is my wedding, the most important day of my life, and you're telling me you won't make it special?" "I want your wedding to be special, but we have to be realistic," I said gently. "There are ways to have a beautiful wedding without spending a fortune." But Melissa wasn't listening. Her anger grew, and she began to accuse me of being selfish, of not caring about her happiness. The conversation spiraled out of control, and before I knew it, we were shouting at each other, saying things that could never be unsaid. "You've always tried to control me," she screamed. "Ever since Mom and Dad died, you've wanted to run my life. Well, I'm done letting you." Her words cut deep, but I knew this wasn't about control. I had given up everything to make sure she had a good life, but in her eyes, it was never enough. The next few weeks were tense. Melissa continued with her wedding plans, ignoring my pleas for compromise. I found myself increasingly isolated, my once close relationship with my sister unraveling before my eyes. I tried to reason with her, to remind her of the sacrifices I had made, but it was no use. Melissa was blinded by her vision of a perfect wedding and the idea that I owed her everything. The final straw came when I discovered that Melissa had taken money from my savings account without asking. I had been putting aside what little I could over the years, hoping to one day return to school or maybe buy a small house. But now, nearly $20,000 was gone, spent on a designer wedding dress and other extravagant expenses. When I confronted her, she didn't even try to deny it. I needed it, David. You said you would help, and this is how you can help. You stole from me, Melissa! I shouted, my voice shaking with anger. How could you do this? She crossed her arms, her expression defiant. I'm your sister. You've always taken care of me, and this is just another way you can do that. The betrayal was too much to bear. I had given up so much for her, and this was how she repaid me, by taking what little I had left for myself. I can't do this anymore, I said, my voice breaking. I've given you everything, and it's never enough. You're not the sister I raised. I don't even know who you are anymore. Melissa's eyes flashed with anger. Fine. If you won't support me, I don't need you in my life. And with that, she walked out, leaving me standing there, feeling more alone than I had ever felt in my life. The weeks leading up to the wedding were a blur. I tried to focus on work, on anything other than the gaping hole where my relationship with Melissa used to be. Friends and family reached out, confused by the sudden rift, but I didn't have the energy to explain. I was too ashamed to admit that after all I had done for her, Melissa had chosen money and material things over our bond. On the day of the wedding, I debated whether or not to go. Part of me wanted to stay home, to avoid the inevitable confrontation, but another part of me, perhaps the part that still loved her despite everything, couldn't stay away. I had been there for every important moment in her life. I couldn't abandon her now, no matter how much she had hurt me. When I arrived at the venue, it was as extravagant as I had feared. The decorations were opulent, the guests dressed to the nines, and the atmosphere buzzing with excitement. But I felt out of place, a spectator in a world that no longer welcomed me. As I watched Melissa walk down the aisle in her designer dress, a mixture of pride and sadness welled up inside me. She looked stunning, radiant even, but all I could think about was how much this moment had cost, not just in money, but in the relationship we had once shared. After the ceremony, during the reception, I tried to approach her, to offer my congratulations, but she brushed me off, too busy mingling with her new family and friends. I felt like a ghost, invisible and irrelevant. Then came the moment I had been dreading, the speeches. As the best man, I was expected to say a few words, but I had nothing prepared. What could I possibly say that wouldn't be a lie? That I was happy for her? That I wished her all the best? The truth was, I was heartbroken, and the thought of standing in front of all those people, pretending that everything was fine, was unbearable. But I had no choice. When it was my turn, I stood up, the eyes of the room on me, and took a deep breath. Melissa, I began, my voice shaky. You know how much I love you. I've watched you grow into an incredible woman, and I'm proud of everything you've accomplished. But I'd be lying if I said this day isn't bittersweet for me. We've been through so much together, and I always thought nothing could come between us. But life has a way of surprising us, doesn't it? I paused, the room deathly quiet. Melissa was staring at me, her expression unreadable. I want you to be happy, I continued, and I want you to have the life you've always dreamed of. But I also want you to remember that family is more important than anything else. We've lost so much already. I don't want to lose you too. With that, I raised my glass, my hands trembling. To Melissa and Tom. May your future be filled with love and understanding. There was a smattering of applause, but the tension in the room was palpable. I sat down, my heart pounding, knowing that my words had fallen on deaf ears. The days after the wedding were some of the darkest I had ever known. Melissa and I didn't speak, and the silence between us grew wider with each passing day. I felt like I had lost not just my sister, but a part of myself. For so long, my identity had been tied to taking care of her, to making sure she had everything she needed. But now, I was adrift, unsure of who I was without that role. The days after the wedding were some of the darkest I had ever known. Melissa and I didn't speak, and the silence between us grew wider with each passing day. I felt like I had lost not just my sister, but a part of myself. For so long, my identity had been tied to taking care of her, to making sure she had everything she needed. But now, I was adrift, unsure of who I was without that role. The months passed slowly. I threw myself into work, trying to fill the void left by Melissa's absence in my life. I stopped answering calls from family members who wanted to know what had happened, avoiding the awkward conversations and pitying looks. I had nothing left to give to anyone. I was running on empty. Meanwhile, Melissa had fully embraced her new life with Tom. Their social media accounts were filled with photos of lavish vacations, fancy dinners, and weekend getaways. It was as if she had moved on completely, leaving me behind in the wreckage. Each new post was a knife to the heart, a reminder of the sister I had lost. One evening, about 6 months after the wedding, there was a knock on my door. When I opened it, I was shocked to see Melissa standing there. She looked different. Her makeup was flawless, her clothes expensive, but there was something in her eyes that I hadn't seen in a long time: vulnerability. "Can I come in?" she asked softly. I stepped aside, unsure of what to expect. She walked into the apartment, glancing around at the same old furniture and decor that hadn't changed since our parents were alive. It was a stark contrast to the luxury she was now accustomed to. "David," she began, her voice trembling, "I know I haven't been the sister you deserve. I've been so caught up in my own life that I lost sight of what's important. I'm sorry." Her words caught me off guard. I had been prepared for another confrontation, for more demands or accusations. But an apology? That was the last thing I expected. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," she continued, "about everything you've done for me, about how I treated you during the wedding. I was wrong. I was selfish. I thought I needed all those things to be happy, but all they did was drive a wedge between us." Tears welled up in her eyes, and I could see the guilt and regret that had been eating away at her. For a moment, I felt my resolve soften, the anger and resentment I had been holding on to starting to melt away. "I don't know if I can ever make it up to you," she said, her voice breaking. "But I want to try. I miss you, David. I miss us." The silence hung between us, heavy with the weight of everything that had been left unsaid. Part of me wanted to reach out, to pull her into a hug and tell her that everything would be okay, but another part of me, the part that had been wounded so deeply, held back. "I don't know what to say, Melissa," I finally replied, my voice hoarse. "You hurt me in ways I never thought you could. I sacrificed everything for you, and it felt like none of it mattered." She nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I know, and I'm so sorry. I don't expect you to forgive me right away, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make things right." Her sincerity was undeniable, and as I looked into her eyes, I could see the sister I had raised, the one I had loved and protected for so long. But I also knew that things could never go back to the way they were. Too much had happened, too much trust had been broken. "I'm not sure we can ever go back to what we had," I said quietly. "But maybe we can start over. Take things one step at a time." She nodded, relief flooding her face. "I'd like that. I just want to be a part of your life again." We spent the rest of the evening talking, reconnecting in a way we hadn't in years. There was still a lot of pain to work through, but for the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, we could find a way forward. The weeks that followed were a tentative dance between rebuilding our relationship and setting new boundaries. Melissa and I started seeing each other more often, grabbing coffee or dinner, but the dynamic between us had changed. I was no longer the doting older brother who would do anything to make her happy. I was learning to say no, to put my own needs first for a change. Melissa, for her part, seemed genuinely committed to repairing the damage. She began to open up about the pressures she had felt leading up to the wedding, the societal expectations, the fear of not being enough, and how she had projected those insecurities onto me. It was a difficult conversation, but it was necessary. We both had to confront the ugly truths about ourselves and our relationship. One day, she surprised me by asking if she could help me with my finances. "I want to repay you, David," she said earnestly. "For everything. I know I can't undo what I did, But I want to make sure you're taken care of, the way you took care of me. I was hesitant at first, not wanting to accept charity, but Melissa insisted. Together, we went over my budget, and she helped me find ways to save money and even invested some of her own to help me rebuild my savings. It was a gesture that meant more than she could ever know. But it wasn't just about the money. Melissa was trying to show me that she understood the sacrifices I had made, and that she was willing to give back in any way she could. It was a sign that she had finally grown up, that she was no longer the spoiled girl who had demanded everything without considering the cost. Slowly, the bitterness that had settled in my heart began to lift. I started to let go of the anger, the resentment, and the sense of betrayal. It wasn't easy, and there were days when I still struggled with the memories of what had happened, but I could see that Melissa was trying, and that made all the difference. One afternoon, as we were sitting in a park, watching the leaves fall, Melissa turned to me and said, "Do you ever think about Mom and Dad?" I nodded. "All the time. I wonder what they would think of us now." She mused. "I think they'd be proud of you, David. For everything you've done, for being the best brother anyone could ask for." Her words hit me hard, and for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to grieve, not just for our parents, but for the relationship we had lost and were now slowly rebuilding. We sat in silence, both of us lost in our thoughts, but it was a comfortable silence, one that spoke of healing and the possibility of a new beginning. As time went on, Melissa and I found a new rhythm in our relationship. It wasn't perfect, and there were still moments of tension and old wounds that occasionally resurfaced, but we were committed to moving forward. We had both grown, both learned hard lessons, and those lessons had brought us closer in a way that we hadn't been in years. One day, Melissa came to me with an idea. "David, I've been thinking. I want to start a charity, something that honors Mom and Dad. I was hoping you'd help me with it." I was surprised but intrigued. "What kind of charity?" She smiled, her eyes lighting up. "Something that supports families who have lost parents, like we did. It could offer counseling, financial support, anything that helps kids who are left in the position we were in." The idea touched me deeply. It was a way to turn our pain into something positive, to give back to others who were struggling like we had. I agreed to help, and together we started planning. It wasn't easy, and there were plenty of obstacles, but it was a project that brought us closer and gave us both a sense of purpose. As we worked on the charity, I began to see the woman Melissa had become, a compassionate, driven person who was determined to make a difference in the world. It was a far cry from the girl who had demanded a $100,000 wedding, and it filled me with pride to see how far she had come. The charity became a success, and as the years went by, it grew into something bigger than either of us had imagined. We were able to help countless families, and in doing so, we found healing in our own lives. Melissa and I still had our ups and downs, but we had learned to communicate better, to respect each other's boundaries, and to appreciate the bond we shared. Our relationship was no longer based on sacrifice or obligation, but on mutual love and respect. Looking back, I realized that the struggles we went through had been necessary. They had forced us both to grow, to confront our flaws, and to learn what truly mattered in life. The price of love isn't measured in dollars, but in the willingness to forgive, to sacrifice, and to support each other through the darkest times. Melissa's wedding had been a turning point, a moment when everything changed, but it was also the catalyst for something better. It had nearly torn us apart, but in the end, it brought us back together, stronger and more united than we had ever been. It was a painful journey, but one that taught us both the true meaning of family and the importance of setting boundaries, even with those we love the most. Years passed, and Melissa and I continued to work on the charity we had founded. It became our shared legacy, a testament to the love and resilience that had carried us through the darkest times. We named it the Whitehaven Foundation, after our parents, to honor their memory and the values they had instilled in us. The foundation grew rapidly, gaining recognition for its work in supporting children and young adults who had lost their parents. We provided scholarships, counseling, and emergency financial assistance, helping countless families avoid the struggles we had faced. The work was challenging but deeply rewarding, and it brought us a sense of fulfillment that neither of us had experienced before. Our parents' loss had shaped our lives in profound ways, but through the foundation, we found a way to turn that pain into something meaningful. We both knew that our parents would be proud of what we had accomplished, and that knowledge gave us peace. Despite the success of the foundation and the improvements in our relationship, there were still moments when the past haunted us. The wounds from Melissa's wedding and the fallout afterward hadn't completely healed, and there were times when old resentments resurfaced. One evening, while we were going through some old photos, Melissa stumbled upon a picture of her in the wedding dress, the very one that had caused so much pain. She stared at it for a long time, her expression unreadable. "Do you regret it?" I asked quietly. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and determination. "Yes, I do. I regret how I treated you, how I let my own insecurities and desires blind me to what really mattered. But I also know that if we hadn't gone through that, we might never have gotten to where we are now." I nodded, understanding what she meant. The wedding had been a turning point, a moment of reckoning that forced us both to confront the truth about ourselves and our relationship. It had been painful, but it had also been necessary. "David," she continued, her voice soft, "I don't think I've ever really thanked you for everything you did for me. Not just for raising me, but for sticking by me even when I didn't deserve it. I know I hurt you, and I'm so sorry." I reached out and took her hand, squeezing it gently. "You don't have to keep apologizing, Melissa. We've both made mistakes, but we've also both worked hard to fix them. What matters is that we're here now, together, and we've learned from it." She smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I'm just glad I didn't lose you, David. I can't imagine my life without you in it." For the first time, I felt a sense of closure, a release from the lingering bitterness that had held me back. We had come full circle, and though the scars would always be there, they no longer defined us. We had learned to forgive each other, and ourselves, and that was what mattered most. As the years went on, Melissa and I continued to grow closer, not just as siblings, but as partners in our mission to help others. The Whitehaven Foundation expanded its reach, and we began to travel more, speaking at conferences, meeting with other charitable organizations, and raising awareness about the challenges faced by children who lose their parents. Through this work, we met many people who shared their own stories of loss and resilience, and each story reminded us of our own journey. We found strength in these connections, and they reinforced our commitment to the Foundation's mission. Melissa and Tom's marriage flourished as well. They eventually had children of their own, and I became an uncle, a role that brought me immense joy. Watching Melissa with her kids, seeing the love and care she gave them, filled me with pride. She had truly come into her own, and I knew that our parents would be proud of the mother she had become. As for me, I finally found the time to pursue some of the dreams I had put on hold for so long. I went back to school, finished my degree, and even started a small business on the side. It wasn't easy balancing everything, but I had learned the importance of taking care of myself, of setting boundaries and prioritizing my own needs. One day, as Melissa and I sat on the porch of the house we had grown up in, a house we had turned into the headquarters of the Whitehaven Foundation, I found myself reflecting on everything we had been through. "So much has changed," I said, gazing out at the sunset. "It's hard to believe how far we've come." Melissa nodded, her eyes filled with contentment. "It's true. But I think everything we went through made us stronger, more resilient. We learned how to love each other in a way that goes beyond just being siblings. We became partners, friends, equals." I smiled, feeling a deep sense of peace. "We did, didn't we? I'm proud of us, Melissa. We've built something amazing together, something that will outlast both of us." She leaned her head on my shoulder, and for a moment, we sat in comfortable silence, soaking in the warmth of the setting sun. "David," she said after a while, her voice thoughtful, "do you ever wonder what would have happened if Mom and Dad hadn't died? If we hadn't gone through all of this?" I considered her question carefully. "I used to think about it a lot," I admitted. But now, I'm not so sure. I think that everything that happened, as painful as it was, brought us to where we are now. And I wouldn't trade that for anything. She smiled, a soft, wistful smile. Me neither. I'm glad we found our way back to each other, even if the road was rough. We stayed there on the porch until the stars came out, talking about the past, the present, and the future. The bond between us, once frayed and nearly broken, was now stronger than ever. We had learned the true meaning of family, not just in the ties of blood, but in the choices we made, the sacrifices we endured, and the love that had ultimately brought us back together. In the end, Melissa's extravagant wedding had nearly torn us apart, but it had also set us on a path to healing, growth, and a deeper understanding of what it meant to be family. We had faced the darkest parts of ourselves and come out the other side, stronger, wiser, and more united. As we said goodnight and went our separate ways, I knew that whatever the future held, we would face it together. The ties that bound us were unbreakable, forged in the crucible of hardship and tempered by the enduring power of love. And that, I realized, was the true legacy of our parents, the gift of a love that could survive anything, even the hardest of times.